I think England is heading towards a civil war. Highly, I think, on Nigel Farage and what he's done with the Reform Party. I'm not so sure that the cavalry can arrive soon enough to avoid some quite unpleasantness in England. You saw my speech yesterday?
I didn't see it.
You didn't go? We let this guy in here. You didn't even see my speech. What the? You're supposed to be a fanboy. You didn't even go see my speech.
What was the speech? Tell us about the speech.
At National Conservatives, I talked. Part of it I talked about the geopolitics of everything. In fact, give me my paper right here.
Yes.
I'll show you what I talked about. This would happen in China this week, right? With the what I call a flex. It's not a conspiracy. President Trump says conspiracy. I think it's deeper than that. But part of that was talking about the situation with our quote unquote allies, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. That as well intentioned as some people are over there, they're not essentially allies because they're all broke. They have no military, no money, no arms, and no political will to do anything in the Ukraine. It's a joke. And I said, if you take them, triage it, Macron's latest parliamentary government's going to fall on Monday or Tuesday. He's going to get a vote of no confidence. Why is he going to get that vote? They're at 7% of deficit to GDP. You can't finance it. We can only finance. We're at 6.5%. The only way we can do it, we've taken over from the pound of being the prime reserve currency. So the world kind of has to, as much as sometimes they don't like it, they have to buy our bonds because they need the dollars, right? The French don't have that luxury, so they're gone. You've now got I think a $50 billion mystery gap in the budget of the UK. Now, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think, is saying it's just a mathematical computation problem. I think she's wrong. But you're broke. And if you see the undercurrents of what's happening right now in England, which we follow pretty closely, given our involvement with Nigel and Brexit and all that, there's some deep undercurrents right now. This spontaneous populist move of putting up the English flag, right? The cross of St. George, and putting up the Union Jack, and then have them taken down by authorities. There's something there. I think you guys, unless there's a big course correction, I think England is heading towards a civil war, unless there's a big course correction. And I'm not even sure, as highly as I think on Nigel Farage and what he's done with the Reform Party, I'm not so sure that the cavalry can arrive soon enough to avoid some quite unpleasantness in England.
So in this new upcoming English Civil War, which side will America land on?
Well, it depends. Some of the progressive left is going to land on the side of the. Look, don't think when the Daily Telegraph story went up by Crilly, and it was like their lead story yesterday, they had, I think, 1,600 to 2,000 comments. 2/3 of the comments saying, "Hey, I think this guy's onto something," because he knew Brexit. 1/3 was like, "Why is Bannon is sticking his nose in it when he focuses in the United States?" As I said in my speech, hey, don't think we don't have the same problem we have in these big cities. This is part of the speech. I was saying, look, this is the main event: getting our country back, solving our problem with mass illegal immigration, getting control of these cities and our border, coupled with taking on the Chinese Communist Party, which is all part of that, because they've been very involved in this, is our priority. That the Middle East, and I quoted Lawrence of Arabia, the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, when Lawrence shows up to the British intelligence in Cairo, and he writes, the Middle East then in World War I was a sideshow. The Arab Revolt was a sideshow to a sideshow. That right now in the Middle East is a sideshow to us. And Israel, particularly the Greater Israel Project, which no one here ever signed on for, is a sideshow to a sideshow. But that we have the problem in Israel that the Israelis ought to be focused on, and the Jewish people throughout the world, is not emanating. The existential threat does not emanate from Tehran. It emanates from what happened in London and what's happening in New York right now. I mean, Mamdani, mother's up to her neck in Qatar money. Mamdani is the Red-Green Alliance, which Sadiq Khan is. And look at the changes in London in the last, 10 years or so. So, no, we have a huge problem here. So where American will come, obviously the populist nationalists will support the populist and nationalist and I've always been a supporter of really Nigel and principally Nigel, but I've always said that Tommy Robinson, what Tommy Robinson and that whole movement represents, has something to say for it. It has something to say from the British working people. And I realize they've got, the lad culture and they're a little rough around the edges, but in their movement over time, I'm just telling you, it's got, particularly the more it gets oppressed, the more that British authorities try to tamp down free expression. What they're doing right now, it's only going to metastasize. And I think that the MAGA movement will clearly come down on the side of the British people.
So in this upcoming civil war, are you talking about a religious war, kind of the Islamic fascists and fanaticists versus native English people?
Yes.
Or with the sort of left on the side of the Islam, and then you've got Farage and everyone else?
Well, remember, Farage is leading reform, and if you hear him, including some of his current speeches, well, let's go back. When Nigel took those couple of years off, ask him. I was one of the biggest guys pushing him all the time. You got to get back in. I mean, hey, you can see where this thing's going, and the Tories are completely hapless, right? They're worse almost in labor, and they give a false impression they're going to do something, and they don't. The Tory party is interesting in that it's actually more hapless than the traditional Republicans here, which is almost mind-boggling, right? So, I was always pushing Nigel to get back in. That being said, and I think Nigel is one of the most important and impressive political figures, not just in modern politics. I think if you look at his record with Brexit and what he's done now in the history of politics, elected politics, what he has done is nothing, with no resources, is nothing short of amazing. He came back in because of the asylum issue and the things. In fact, he was sending me the videos that he was doing. Remember, for a year, he walked up and down the beaches and just would see the boats coming in. And he saw it before. If you see, and Nigel is not someone that has his hair on fire, right? If you see even some of his speeches today, some of the warnings that are in the speeches, people should take that quite seriously because Nigel is not an extremist. Nigel is pretty, what I call him a barroom Thatcherite, right? He is actually a man of the center right, truly. You should see the pleading kind of in his voice as he's talking about reform and what reform would do, because I believe things may be spinning out of control, particularly with the major economic. Britain's going to go through a major economic downturn. If you don't think it's going to do a downturn, which I've been saying, just look at the bond market. It's not Steve Bannon saying this. It's the international global bond market are saying, your 30-year bonds, we're not so sure we're that enthusiastic about these because we're not actually sure who or what's going to be around to pay it back, right? So you should take a warning from like the bond market turfed out trusts and that crowd. You should take a warning that the bond market, the global capital markets are quite concerned about what they're seeing here directionally.
You call Nigel a barroom-style Thatcherite.
Right.
Now, I would call
I tease him with that.
You're more of a kind of Leninist revolutionary, a kind of, radical, I don't want to say conservative, but right-winger. You hate conservatism
Yeah,
and
I'm a
conservatives.
right-winger.
Right.
I wouldn't say Leninist, but we want to seize the institutions. We do think that in revolutionary movements, you have to take control. Now, if you watch the show, every day we're telling President Trump, we're recommending maximalist strategy, take it to absolutely the ultimate end, do it with a sense of urgency, and seize the institutions while you're doing it, which he's doing.
So should Nigel do the same thing? Does he need a bit more revolutionary zeal from Steve Bannon?
Nigel Farage has now a political party that literally has no money, right? That he's built on force of will and personality and thoughts and how people believe in him. That its polling shows that it's ahead of the Tories and Labour combined. So I don't think Nigel needs my recommendations. Now, what I will say, and this gets back to where I think if you look at the subtext, remember the first time I met Nigel with Raheem, I traveled around with him in the hinterland of England, of which were the people that delivered the votes, the Brexit, and it was like the Tea Party back in the old days. And I saw Nigel work in rooms of 25 up to 100 people. I know the kind of contact he has. I know the kind of man he is. I hear in his voice today, and I hear when he starts on certain things, it's Nigel giving people a warning that the hour is late, right? And things have to happen. And if they don't happen, it may be too late to do it through a normal political process. That's what I say, that I think you are collapsing at a faster rate than even the French, and the French are collapsing pretty well. And it's Starmer's been more feckless, but you haven't changed. It's the institutions that haven't changed. BBC is still as bad as it's ever been. You've just passed, you now have, I don't know if the English people totally understand this from people who look on the outside, you have put in draconian laws against free speech to try to stop people from addressing this issue. That's not going to work, not in the modern age, right? It's going to spin out of control unless, and I think that given your system, because Starmer's clearly, technocrats it's not a time for technocrats. You don't have, I was talking to Julian Tedder, I heard her talk the other day in Morning Joe, that it shows now with Starmer's polling so low, that, Julian Tedder, the Financial Times, that it's a tough time to be a technocratic centrist. Your problems are not technocratic problems around the center of the country, right? You have extreme problems brought on by extreme policies that have impacted the British people. One of the counselors, I think, was some Labour counselor, called the rape victims, I think it was, of the sexual abuse, white trash the other day. It shows you that you have such a big gap over there. And I believe that if you continue down that path, you're going to get beyond the ability of elective politics as we know it today to solve it.
Do you get the sense that Nigel is moving towards your direction? I interviewed him last year and I asked about mass deportations. He said it wasn't his ambition. He said he was against mass deportations, it's politically impossible. And now, a couple of months ago, he's completely reversed ferret. So do you think he's kind of shifting towards the Bannon night?
Yes, because it's history drives you there. Why have I been right on this from the beginning? And people should understand, and the people in the chats of the Daily Telegraph said, Bannon, you're not looking at your problems in our country. Trust me, I deal with this every day, and they're 100% correct. We have not had the mass deportations yet. Remember, we have, I say, 10 to 11 million on Biden's watch, which I think is what we have to deal with. President Trump saying it's 20 million. Whatever it is, it's a massive number. That they all have to go home. They have to be. Now, we've had a lot of self-deportations, but right now what President Trump is focused on is the bad hombres, right? Now, as he takes over these cities and federalizes the National Guard, you are seeing additional deportations coming out of that, right? But as you've had these law and order, this imposition of law and order into these basically lawless cities like Washington, D.C., and I think soon to come Chicago and New Orleans and Detroit and New York and L.A. But we haven't started the mass deportations. Nigel's definitely come our way, as I think other people are coming our way in France and Germany. People are coming to the conclusion, and eventually in Italy. You have these populations that got here through all these different means, and they're not assimilating, and also it's a massive financial burden. It just can't stay. Plus, it's such a detriment to your own population. So mass deportations, when we first brought this up, and President Trump started talking about it, we were considered the most radical people in the world. Remember, we were bringing it up at a time, or even before, but when they allowed 10 to 20 million people, think about that, 10 to 20 million people into the United States when we were talking about mass deportation. So no, it's, I think the world's coming our way because the world's seeing the problems. And I think Nigel is coming to the realization that more dramatic, this is what I was saying, it was a perfect example of, if you listen to the content of Nigel's talks, even if you see the timbre of his voice, he's giving warnings to people. I just hope people understand that Nigel Farage, who's pretty much a man of the center right, is actually warning you that something has to happen here, and it has to happen pretty dramatically. And the institutions of England are not even, forget going there, they're not even to stopping the problem right now.
Now, you're warning that if things don't change in Britain and other places, democracy will not be enough. The democratic ballot will not be enough. What do you mean by that? What kind of revolution are we talking about?
I think people, if they see elections that don't have impact, thank God here, this is why the come from behind, out of nowhere victory of Trump in 24 and kind of sweeping everywhere, is really has given us the leverage to try to do these types of things. And people, the MAGA movement, and even the black men, the African American men, the black men, and the Hispanics that voted for us are seeing that we're taking action, particularly securing the border. Think about it. A year ago this time, Biden's telling you the border can't be sealed. It's impossible. You can't do it. We've tried everything. Trump did it in 60 days. So it's people are seeing the impact of where elections have consequences, and those consequences are what I voted for. I think in England's the exact opposite. I think they're actually questioning, because your institutions are so powerful in England, right? The non-directly political institutions are so powerful, they're not changing at all, particularly your media. In fact, you're going the opposite direction on this. And I would just tell people and warn them, the more you try to suppress speech, you're just throwing gasoline on the fire. In the modern world, you're not going to be able to suppress speech. Yes, you can put some people in jail. You can try to be a speech Nazi and do that. It's only going to metastasize what you're trying to stop. And I think that that's where I see the policies, and I quite frankly see the globalists and the ruling class in England trying to go the opposite direction, and it's not going to work. It's just building, I think, because that take it to the streets effort, and this is what shows in the flags coming up overnight. I mean, that's a massive logistical exercise. Don't think that that's, we live and breathe here in the grassroots and having people actually go out and do things. Those putting up the flags overnight is a massive logistical, you have to have people that really put time and think it through. Don't think that's a signal, not a noise. And people should take that very seriously, and they're not. They're trying to, once again, suppress it. They're trying to take them down, and that's just going to be fine. It's not going to be fine. You've got to address these issues, and the issues are you've allowed untold number of asylum seekers or illegal, just basically aliens into your country with no thought at all of assimilating. It's put such a financial burden that now, and I'm telling you, you're going to have a massive financial crisis about this current budget that's going on. And you're going to have, they have very few alternatives. The one alternative is to come back and do the exact thing you don't want to do right now, which is raise taxes on property, on income. At the moment that you ought to try to be freeing up the animal spirits, they're going to go to the exact opposite. It's going to be a fiasco. And if you see how this thing plays out, I think it ends in tears.
So do you think the economy could take down Starmer and his government?
I think it's taking it down right now. Starmer's in the low 20s. I think that, and I always said, I was the first guy to call that he was going to be the next prime minister years ago. I said, this guy in labor. And I think he's overwhelmed by events, right? You've had this current scandal with the taxes, but I think the bigger scandal is exactly what's the budget, what are the real numbers, what are we talking about? Folks remember, Truss got turfed out because of the same issue. Came out with a budget she couldn't back up with numbers, and they wouldn't put any numbers out. They said, oh, well, we know we actually technically have 3 months to do it. I would say on the show every day, I said, no, you don't. You got to get those out this afternoon, because the bond market gets to vote every minute of every day, and they said, we don't trust these people. We have no earthly idea what's going on. She's given a tax cut at the exact time that they ought to be trying to drive more revenues, a Reagan-type tax cut. And I even said at the time, Larry Kudlow said it was the greatest thing ever. I said, for that moment in time, it's not going to work, and it didn't work. I think right now it's just kind of overcome by events. The polls are pretty dramatic. When Labor and Tories combine, it's not like the Tories have an alternative, but when both parties combine are below the polling of the Reform Party, which has a couple of 3 guys in Parliament, and Nigel on TV every night, and they're building a grassroots organization throughout the country. When the people are saying, I've heard from Tories, I just gave the biggest overwhelming victory to Labor ever to give them everything they need. This thing's all fucked up. Maybe we look at another alternative.
Starmer has just an 11% approval rating,
11,
which is like even lower than the Tories had at the end of their parliament. You talk about Liz Truss and the Conservatives. Let's briefly mention them. Sometimes they come to DC, sometimes they come to America, and they make speeches to American conservatives who all clap, and think that they're brilliant. Do you think there's a kind of naivety here in America over some of these Tories who, maybe are pretending they're a bit more conservative than they really are?
Well, the people clapping for them are the kind of rhino Republicans. And I do know former Prime Minister Truss, and I like her personally, right? And she wrote a book. It's pretty good. She's trying to start a new media thing there. I think she's got a lot of spirit. I think her term had to address certain problems, and her Chancellor of Exchequer just in doing it have to understand I tell you, the populist nationalists are not clapping for the Tories that come over here to CPAC or national conservatism. You don't see any of those clapping for him. They'll clap for Nigel Farage. They'll show up for Nigel because they understand Nigel is a man of action that's changed political history. And he has a lot of built-up capital here. But this is what and you made a very interesting point about how Nigel's coming more our way, mass deportation. When Nigel Farage, who has been doing this for a long time, finally comes to the conclusion of something he has said for years we don't need to go to. When he says, hey, we're going to have to do mass deportations, people should take that like a papal bull. That is a guy that has built something from nothing, understands the politics, and also understands, I think, the psychology of the British voter, what they're prepared to take in at any one period of time. When he comes to that to me is a red warning light that people should understand that even people from the center are going to policies, the Steve Bannon extreme policies, that they're looking at the math, they're seeing what's going on, and they're coming to the conclusion that this should happen. Look, President Trump ran on mass deportations. When you think about mass deportations, the logistics, in our bill, the big beautiful bill, the British people would be shocked by this. It's $170 billion just allocated to the logistics of sealing the border and the logistics of building up the network to do the mass deportations and to hire the people in ICE. $170 billion. I think that's multiple times larger than the British military. So it is shocking at the scale of this. And
It's
so
like what we spend on the NHS, pretty much.
no, but I'm telling you, and the mass deportations you're going to have to do are not going to be free. This is what I keep saying. If you project down, and this is why I'm so dismissive of Starmer and Macron particularly, when they come over here and they act like big shots and they're going to do this, and Starmer is going to he's going to put in 30,000 troops and they're going to do this in Ukraine. They're not going to do anything in Ukraine because Macron's about to be turfed out, or at least the prime minister of the parliamentary party, and I think this may actually have a vote of no confidence in him and try to expedite or try to bring forward that. Same thing in England. You just don't have, Starmer doesn't have the firepower. And it's only going to get worse if you look at downstream, particularly where the economy's going, it's only going to get worse. So no, he's 11%. He's pretty tapped out. I happen to think, and people tell me I'm dead wrong, I think eventually they turn to Sadiq Khan, and Sadiq Khan becomes prime minister. And then you're in it. So, but I think that's coming. I realize there's a lot of politics in labor I don't follow and I don't care to follow, but I just see that this one's gonna, I think it's gonna end in Sadiq Khan as prime minister, and then your next shift of government will be Nigel Farage will be prime minister.
Maybe Mamdani will be president.
Well, Mamdani, he's not. I'm telling you. So I was the first one early on to say that people better take this guy seriously, but just for the reason of, in building helping to build and assisting to build the precinct strategy, which was central to this grassroots movement when people abandoned President Trump, of getting President Trump reelected in 24. I know the difficulty, and this is what Nigel's building now. Building a grassroots movement when you don't have a ton of resources for it is labor intensive, and it's hard. It's tough. Mamdani has the Working Families Party and the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, I think it is. Those two are a machine when it comes to grassroots. I would tell people, and they're running in this primary, I said, hey, Cuomo's raised all this money and he's doing everything by the book that a traditional Democrat should do. He's getting all the right endorsements, raised all the money, doing the commercials. But I said, these other guys have 10,000 people in Brooklyn on a Tuesday afternoon that are canvassing, going door to door, that he's going to win. And they've built up a machine right now, and none of these other guys have dropped out, and they haven't consolidated the vote. So he's a serious political power. And I tell people it's the Red-Green Alliance. It's neo-Marxism with, not jihadists, but in back of them are jihadists. His mother took all this money from Qatar. He's another Sadiq Khan. And it's very serious. And President Trump now is saying, I'm forcing guys out. And I told the donors this, and they called me up the weekend after the guy won and wanted me to work on this. I said, guys, you're not serious. You're just not serious. You're not addressing what's happened in the school system. Look, he's running, and there's a guy said he would arrest Netanyahu, which, you know, I'm not arguing with. He said he would arrest Netanyahu if he ever came to the UN. 57% or 60% of the young of Jewish voters under 30 are going to vote for Mamdani. As of right now, I think 20% or a third of his staff or the principal advisors around him are young Jewish professionals, either financial, media, political operatives, social media influencers. So people should not laugh him off. And when they take charge in New York City, which is the financial capital of the world, they're not just going to turn it over, right? These people, if you look at the Working Families Party and DSA, I mean, these are not socialists. And George Will and all these Republicans in there, well, let a socialist run it for a couple of years, people get tired of it. I said, they don't roll like that. You talk about Leninist, the Working Family Party and the DSA, these are hardcore revolutionaries. And when they get their grips on New York City, the financial capital of the world, they're not going to let it go. So this is very, very serious. And that's my speech the other day. For the existential threat to the Israel and to the Jewish people, don't look to Tehran, right? Tehran hates you and they're an enemy. I got that. But the ticking time bomb is in the streets of Brussels, Paris, London, and now in New York City.
Now, Nigel Farage recently came to Washington for a congressional hearing on freedom of speech in the UK. J.D. Vance and others in the administration have put pressure onto European countries over their crackdowns on freedom of speech. And there are some people on the left in the UK or the liberal media who are arguing or concerned about the administration trying to take down Starmer. Do you think the administration is trying to take down the Labour government?
You mean this administration?
Yeah.
I think President Trump thinks very highly of Starmer. Personally, you ask anybody around President Trump, I think he likes the guy a lot. No, I don't think see any activity on that whatsoever. I don't. And I think President Trump, you can see from when Starmer was here 3 Mondays ago, I'm actually surprised, and I'm surprised that President Trump gives Starmer and Macron as much time as he gives them. He likes, you can tell, he has a personal chemistry with Starmer. I'm not saying that may not separate in time over time, particularly if Starmer, you know, I'm not sure the president's been fully briefed on Starmer's 11%, approval rating, but you can tell, I think he likes the guy, and I don't see anything coming in at all, and we're pretty close on, you have JD and some other people talking about it, as we are trying to just warn about it. I don't think anybody is doing it in the Labour government. They're doing all that themselves. They're doing more of that themselves. The people on the left, the more you try to suppress speech, the more free speech you're going to get. It's just obvious. It's going to happen. You're going to draw many more people. This is what happened here in the United States in the suppression during the COVID and then the election denial. Remember, this show, as you're sitting here in this room, is one of the biggest, most powerful shows in all of America. We're not on any big platforms. We've been banned on YouTube. We're banned on Facebook. We're banned on Twitter. We're banned on Google, all of them, because they try to suppress us during the pandemic. And then after the election, it was like, get these guys out of here. It only made the show bigger. I tell these guys, if you suppress things and you put out good content, people will find it. And I think you're going to see this in the UK. I think this is going to be one of the things that exacerbate a potential civil war. Because folks are going to say, I see what they're doing. They're coming for my speech. Eventually they're going to come for me. And I'm not going to tolerate it. So I think that Starmer and Labor should definitely not look at the Trump administration of doing, even Bannon and the War Room are not doing that. I mean, we're not trying to take the guys down. We're trying to warn, and we say every day that they're completely hapless and feckless. And Nigel is gonna be the next change of government prime minister.
You mentioned earlier we've got this Chinese military parade marking the 80th anniversary of the Second World War.
British should be infuriated by this, because what they try to do, remember, the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely obsessed with their legitimacy. And after the war, we had a Chinese Civil War, and eventually the American State Department basically and the Chinese Communist Party did very little fighting against the Japanese in World War II. It was mainly the nationalists and the British, the CBI, and the Americans, General Stilwell. They're trying to cloak themselves, and then at Tiananmen Square, the Americans bailed them out. The whole West bailed out Deng Xiaoping and these guys. they're trying to cloak themselves. They're trying to cloak themselves in the legitimacy of being a participant in ending the Second World War. If you're just, because remember, we didn't have any commemoration here in the United States outside of War Room and a couple of veterans that showed up at the World War II monument and they had a little row of chairs. There was no commemoration here for the signing of the surrender instrument by the Japanese, none. I mean, we intercut that day, the Shanghai meeting went on beforehand, the Shanghai Cooperation Council, which is their alternative to the West. We intercut footage of General Percival and Wainwright's, signing the instrument on the deck of the Missouri, intercut with what they were doing to try to take the glory of it. They're trying to say, no, we actually did that. That shows you they have a problem with legitimacy. But this is President Trump said, hey, if they're going to conspire, we'll see with that. What my warning kind of President Trump, this is not a conspiracy. This is a flex. This is a flex. This is the main event. People have to understand, and England's got a worse problem than the United States, as bad as our problem. You're completely infested with Chinese Communist Party influencers that have paid guys, right? There's a fabulous book that almost got banned in Britain by the Australian. I think it's called The Hidden Hand. It came out a number of years ago. It almost got banned in England. It talks about this very topic. All of your cultural institutions have been infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party, by Chinese Communist Party money. And so you have a problem, and they're the existential threat to the West. And my only recommendation to President Trump, remember, I'm the only civilian in the history of this country to be fully sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. The day that President Trump left office, it was Pottinger, Navarro, Pompeo, and myself. The other three were in the government. I had been a civilian for 3 years because I kind of am the leader of the anti-CCP movement here, and more importantly, or as importantly, the hard out, the decoupling. We have to hard decouple now. We have to cut off all capital, and when I say capital, equity capital, bank financing. We have to cut off all technology, and I don't mean just technology that they're stealing. I mean no selling them technology anymore. We have to cut out no expertise. In other words, they can't work in labs, they can't work in research departments, universities. And then last, we had to send all 350,000 Chinese students back to China immediately. We have to be a hard decouple. President Trump has worked with these people so hard. He worked for 2 years with Lighthizer to get the 2019 deal. That deal would have solved all the problems in the world's economy from the West issues with China, not just counterfeiting, but excess capacity, state-owned industries, all of it. And after 2 years of negotiations, when they agreed to it, before they signed, they tore it up. After they had a Shanghai Cooperation Committee big meeting on One Belt, One Road, and Putin was there, and Xi and these guys realized, and this is when they went to kind of their decoupling from Western technology. This is where DeepSeek came out of, the artificial intelligence. It's where TikTok came out of. They want to be off the grid with the Americans on technology and have their own technology. So now's the time. If you don't cut them off now, it's gonna be too late. And so we have to have a hard decouple. And I realize that on the Wall Street guys, they hate it. The big tech guys hate it. The corporatists hate it. F them, right? They got us into this mess. We can't be looking. This is years of neoliberal, neocon policies right there. That's what it got you. It got you. World War II was fought over control of the Eurasian landmass, right? This got you to the same place 80 years later. Think about the British troops that surrendered in Singapore, that died on building the Burma Railroad. Those Brits that died in the air in the Blitz. What would they think? Like the Americans, what would they think 80 years later, given their sacrifice, that we're in a situation that the leaders of the countries who are on the payroll of these guys have allowed this to happen? Would they say 80 years after, on the day of the surrender, yeah, I don't remember the Chinese Communist Party having much to do with this. What the fuck is this, right? Think about them. We owe them the respect to say your sacrifice was worth it. And here you have today, they're in your grill. This is a flex. And if people don't see it as a flex, and here's the thing that concerns me. In the United States, with the way the media is, because they're so freaking dumb and paid off, just like in Britain, this gets, it's a military parade, and it's not. It's so much deeper than a military parade. They're talking about that their system is a rising system. And Mitch McConnell comes out and blames it on tariffs and blames it on Ukraine. Nothing could be farther. the policies that tariffs are trying to reverse, neoliberal economics, and the policies that America First are trying to do away with, which is what Ukraine was about, it's the neoliberal, neocon policies that got us in this mess. It's only America First that's going to get us out. And in Britain will be Nigel Farage and or folks farther to the right.
Just on the history, Yung Chang, she wrote a book about Mao, and she actually argues the Chinese communists at the time were trying to fight the nationalists during the war and trying to disrupt basically the war effort against the Japanese.
No, that's what I tried to say yesterday. If you look at actually what happened, she's 100% correct, and all the military histories of the time said it. What we had Stilwell, who was, and remember, he was actually our best general before the war. He should have been the guy that would have been Marshal. He was the guy, but as a young man, he had gone over to China in the 1920s in the age of the warlords. They sent him over because we had a Marine and I think Army division over there at the time around Shanghai. He learned Mandarin. And so when the war started, he thought he was going to get the senior command for Operation Torch, which was going to be the invasion of North Africa to relieve Montgomery in the British, I think, 8th Army in North Africa, or to help them drive Rommel out. At the last minute, about a year before then, Roosevelt met with him and said, no, we're starting a new command, the China-Burma-India Command. He's going, what the fuck is that, right? You're going there because that's how important it is to war. And it's an incredibly important theater of the war because particularly given the surrender at Singapore, which shocked everybody, right? And the whole collapse, not just of the islands, but the collapse of really of Asia with Hong Kong and Singapore. It's a major part of the war that has never really been fully developed, right? I've studied because I went to Asia so much times, and I'm obsessed with it as a major theater of the war. Stilwell was sent as the chief of staff for Chiang Kai-shek in the Nationalist. The history of the war is Mao and these guys literally fought the Nationalists. They didn't. In fact, they tried to exacerbate the Japanese because they were saying
they provoked the Japanese.
Provoked the Japanese. Said we want to bleed out. We want to bleed out the. We want to bleed out the Chinese nationalists. We want to make sure that Americans understand that it's futile, that you don't want to be involved in here because it's just a mess. And this is why in 1949, it was General Marshall went to the mountains and sat with Mao, and he had Edgar Snow, who wrote Red Star, who was essentially, later we find out, was actually on their payroll, and was worse than a payroll. He was a true believer, as many guys in the State Department were. And there was something to believe. Look, Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang, they're not saints, okay? They were so corrupt, and Stilwell, who a pretty rough character himself, he couldn't take it. I mean, he would fly back all the time and tell Roosevelt, these are the most corrupt people in the world, and they're not great fighters either. But after the war, essentially after Marshall went, and this is why they have a problem with legitimacy. This is why they're doing this. They want, because the world saw this and go, hey, I guess the Chinese Communist Party kind of beat the Japanese and kind of won World War II. We should thank them. It didn't. This is why it's information war. And here in the United States, they're playing. Yeah, it's a great military. You know, Collins is on there, CNN's on there, and they're just mouthing. Yeah, it's a celebration, a commemoration of the Japanese surrender. Never mention the fact that these people had nothing to do with it. In fact, fought essentially as allies to the Japanese because they realized after the Japanese are beaten, right? Because the Americans are going to beat them by air power. Then we'll take on the nationalists and we'll win this. And in 4 years of civil war, we turned the country over to them, right? When they didn't really have legitimacy, we turned it over to them and said, oh, they're agrarian reformers, right? This is like the Ayatollah being a moderate Muslim, right? This is like Mandami. Oh, he's just a socialist. He's far from a socialist. So no, they're making a huge effort in this, and this is going to have a big impact.
It's fascinating. You talk about Edgar Snow. It wasn't just Edgar Snow. This was an American journalist who followed Mao in the 1930s.
Red Star of China.
Exactly.
One of the most powerful books ever written about
that book was essentially a propaganda book
100%.
About Mao and about the Chinese communists in the 30s,
Yes.
and was read in the White House under FDR, and all of these officials, they thought that Mao was the person that they should cooperate with. And you also have Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, who was basically Stalin's, propagandist in the West.
He was actually as bad as Edgar Snow was in the lies. They were caught up in the romance of the Long March and the corruption of Imperial Japan and the warlords. So it's not that China hadn't gone through a time of turbulence, right? It was pretty awful. and they got caught up in the romance of Mao and the overall agrarian reform, and they looked the other way to the bullets in the head and everything like that. Because remember, when Mao got to the mountains, there's a great scene for your audience in Red Star of China. When they get to, after doing the 10,000-mile long march, right, and going from north all the way through the south and back up to the mountains, they're in the mountain, I think it's Yuan, they're in the mountain fastness, and they're going to hide it. Basically, they're so beat up, right, and they've lost so many people that they're going to hide out for a couple of years and rebuild their strength in this mountain citadel, this fastness. And the people, this is in 1932 or 33, it's mid-30s. In 1930, less than 100 years ago, the folks up there all lived in caves. And the Chinese, as Edgar Snow said, the Chinese communists are building huts and yurts in the plains. And the guys are sitting there going, these communists, how can they run anything? They're so idiotic. Human beings live in caves up here. Only savages, dumb savages would build stuff above earth. And I'm sitting there going, good God. That's one of the things that grabbed Edgar Snow. Durrani was worse in the 1930s in Ukraine, because remember, Ukraine's the Kansas of Europe. In the 1930s, the Holodomor? They starve 5 million people with great harvesters to take the wheat and send it in the corn and to send it to Moscow, because they're doing collectivizations on all the peasants, so nothing's being grown there, and they send everybody to these factories to work, which they don't. They say, what am I doing here? And they got to get grain, so they steal. And he's writing it up like it's
there's
fun.
plenty of food.
Plenty of food, and the Moscow show trials are the worst. Stalin is as bad as Hitler, right? When you talk about the number of people killed and the brutality of it. I tell the people, the Chinese Communist Party is worse, right? Because the Chinese Communist Party has killed, I think, or murdered, forget the forced abortions, these guys have killed 200 or 250 million Chinese, Lao Beijing, starved them to death, tortured them to death, shot them, killed them, don't care.
Straight after the Civil War, there's a huge massacre of people.
A huge massacre of people. It's unbelievable. But this is what...
But the Americans were backing, Mao kind of implicitly at the beginning of the war, and then they realized later on, they were like, we need to reverse policy here. But it basically allowed Mao to...
The only way you reverse policy is McCarthy. McCarthy has an amazing book that he wrote that nobody reads and nobody wants to talk about, called Retreat from Victory. He walks through the whole thing of how did we get to... Because if you look at World War II, you can actually say it didn't end in 45, even the military part. It continued on the mainland of China with the Civil War, and then actually went into Korea, which was really the Chinese. It wasn't really the Koreans, that was the Chinese trying to drive the Americans off of the landmass, of the Eurasian landmass. You see where that these guys are experts. There was McCarthy and really the Republicans that said, who lost China? It was Henry Luce at Time magazine. It was many people that had been associated with the missionary movement, or either his young kids like Luce and others had been, because remember, British and American missionaries were all over China in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, before really the Civil War or the coming of the communists to force them out. Many of those people had a great love for China and the Chinese people, as I do, the Lao Beijing. And a lot of these were outraged by what happened with the intellectuals, the effete intellectuals in the State Department. But you have to remember, Roosevelt's administration was infested with Soviet agents and Russian agents. Look, the last 2 years of the war, and the Russian people bore the brunt of the Wehrmacht. I mean, they lost, 30, 35 million troops. Forget the civilians that got starved to death in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, all that. They lost 35 million troops. As much as the British Americans' valor in the Western Front, I think our casualties were 2.5, 3 million in aggregate, right? So these people lost 10 times more than we did because, hey, they were starting. But starting in 1943, it was pretty obvious in the War Department, of which we now today start calling it the War Department again. Back when we won things.
About that, yeah.
Back when we won things, people were sitting there going, "Hang over a second. These guys are making huge progress. Do we still need to send as many weapons as we're sending? We're kind of oversending." And of course, Harry Hopkins and this crowd, who were quite close to Stalin, and there's been a lot of controversy about Alger Hiss and other people in the government, about having Soviet sympathies or actually working as KGB, that to overarm Stalin. So at the end of the war, and then stopping Montgomery from going to Berlin, stopping Patton from going to Berlin, 60 miles away, just stopping with no, and that's never been explained to this day. Why did you have Market Garden? Why did you have, in Normandy, why did you have Market Garden to try to get us there quicker? Why did you have Patton going across France in a race for Berlin, and then you just stop the two guys? And Montgomery gives you a plan that I can be there in 5 or 6 days, and he's actually told not just stand down, but shut the fuck up, right? So the whole thing
Well, that's
stinks.
all Eisenhower. But you've got to ask, because FDR was kind of conspiring with Stalin against Churchill, and he was completely duped by Stalin. But you talk about McCarthy. McCarthy wanted to nuke Korea. He wanted to.
No, it was MacArthur.
MacArthur, sorry.
Yeah,
MacArthur.
MacArthur wanted to, I think his phrase, he wanted to put a cobalt wall at the Yalu River. He wanted to seal off Korea from China because there was 1 million troops. Here's how shifty Mao is. The way they run the Civil War, there was an army general who was a nationalist general, because they used to do this all the time in China. He was one of the top commanders for the nationalists. He flipped sides. He changed sides, and in that changing side really shifted the center of gravity to the Civil War so that Mao and the communists won. When they started the war in Korea, right, almost immediately, because it was 49, the Civil War ends, 50, the Korean War starts. Mao sends that general in his division, he's going to be the guy that they recommend to go to Korea, and Mao sends his son with him, which is on a death mission because they have no arms, they have nothing. These are the ones in freezing sub-zero temperatures were just going after the Americans, the Marines, and the army that was there, just wave after wave after wave. They were slaughtered, but they did push the Americans back almost off the peninsula. Mao's son died up there. So, I mean, the story is Xi's father, who was a young guy at the time, very young lieutenant when they got to, I think it was Hunan or Yuan, when they got to the mountain fastness. One of the first things Mao had him do was take the top guys, Chou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping were kind of excluded, but some other, he thought maybe overly ambitious guys, and shoot them. So these are ruthless people, and we have to know what we're dealing with.
Knows that well. Just on the War Department thing, do you think that sends a message? So just for people who don't know, the Department for Defense has now been changed to the Department of War.
Well, it was Department of War from the time it was set up. And it had a pretty good track record, right? We essentially won everything we were involved in. And then after 1945, when we started doing the American Empire project, it was shifted to the Department of Defense. They thought that would be, in the containment policy against the Soviets and not to freak the Soviets out, was shifted to the Department of Defense. And President Trump goes, hey, I think I want to go back to when we won these things. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of this. I think it couldn't be better. It's so Trumpian. Right, to do it, seize the institutions. But it's not just renaming it. You're putting in a whole different mentality. That if we're going to use the resources of the Pentagon, if we're going to commit to them, it's going to be in a war-type scenario, and it's going to be about victory. And I think that's what sets Trump up from the endless wars. I mean, what's destroyed this country, a big part of it, these endless wars, not just the people that we've lost, the young men and women have been magnificent, but the $9 trillion we spent in a sideshow in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think it's long overdue, and I think, quite frankly, the people that we owe this to, the people that really won World War II, would appreciate it. And by the way, the British people should be outraged at this, given the sacrifice of the British in Asia, right? In Asia, given the sacrifice of the British people in Asia, to see that. And to see everything that the Brits and the Indians, right, as our allies did to defeat this, and know that these are the exact guys that worked against it and were actually allies of the Japanese, should be outraged. And I didn't see any of that outrage on BBC. I didn't see any of that outrage on British media. And this is why I think they're worthless.
Well, we had General Slim, who was one of our best generals in the
Yes.
war, and we had this great defeat or victory over the Japanese at the end of the war. I think it was called Impala, was it?
Yeah.
In
The
sort of Burma.
Irrawaddy River and then Impala. I mean, you had massive victories on the Indian front to stop it. Now, the Indians would argue, this is what, and I think it's a big lesson, the Indian National Congress, I think, it wasn't so much Gandhi. He was a figure, I think he did a great job, but really what drove that were the enlisted men, the non-commissioned Indian officers who actually, after Singapore, there was a big question of why exactly have we let these white guys run things with only a handful of troops when they surrendered, quite frankly, so quickly. And I think that's the valor and the courage that you see on things like The Bridge on the River Kwai, the book or the movie, and the history of the Burma, the railroad. But stopping the Japanese in these battles, right, from getting the jewel of the crown, I think reinforced in the Indian non-commissioned officers, like, hey, after this thing's over, shouldn't we run our own deal? And I think that had as big an impact. I think those victories and the toughness and steeliness of the Indian troops to bear the brunt of that, I think informed those people that at the end of this thing, we got to run. And Gandhi was obviously, and Nehru and all that were very important, but I think it's those non-commissioned officers that actually fought for it and said, we got to run our own deal at the end of this thing.
Let's talk about India briefly, because I know Modi met with Xi, and obviously...
Now, it's very important that headline, this is a very important headline. Xi hails China's unstoppable power in show of solidarity with Putin and Kim. It's quite important that Modi's name's not there. Modi went to the Shanghai Cooperation meeting. That was a 3-day meeting beforehand. He refused to go to the parade, and most particularly refused to stand on the podium. That's very important. I mean, India's kind of the key that picks a lot strategically. Now, obviously, there's tremendous issues. President Trump and Peter Navarro have a big issue on the trade deal, particularly on services, of how, according to Peter Navarro, they've been ripping us off. We're not there on a trade deal yet.
And the Russian oil.
The Russian oil, but the Russian oil, that's what I said yesterday, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. China's buying just as much, right? You gotta charge them. We gotta put the tariff on them too. If you're gonna put it on the Indians, and I agree, if this is your sanctions, you should do it. India needs that oil from somewhere. Also, the Chinese should be, the mullahs, sanctioned. That oil is already sanctioned. All you have to do is stop the flow of it. So it should be done, and you choke the Chinese Communist Party down of energy, because if you add Russian and the mullahs and the Persian oil, you're virtually 100%. So no, look, India's a problem. You also have the stuff of abuse of visas and the H-1B visa program. The American people, you had Jack and guys yesterday, Pasobic. There was and I think the world of the Indians, Modi, the whole guys around Modi, I'm very close to a lot of these guys. Something's changing here on that's got to be addressed. I think people are saying, hey, it's been too much abuse by the big tech companies, but the Indians are also taking advantage of it, and it's got to stop, and I think that's going to be an issue.
Right, final question. This was on the strike against the narco-terrorists in international waters recently. People like Rand Paul think that this was a terrible case of breaking kind of civil liberties, and we shouldn't just summarily execute people, we should capture them and give them a trial. Where do you fall on that scale?
I think given the deaths caused by the fentanyl and the narco-terrorists, as a naval officer, I think the rules of engagement that obviously had to come from the Secretary of Defense. I think my strong belief is that those rules of engagement are appropriate and send the right message that we're at war with these guys. I mean, I'm all for, this is the second opium war. What happened in the opium war is now they're trying to reverse it with fentanyl and other drugs. They're in partnership with Venezuela. They're in partnership with the cartels in Mexico. It's quite harsh, but I think more of this has to happen. My only fear right now is that we have a amphibious readiness group. The Iwo Jima readiness group is off the coast of Venezuela in the Gulf of America, and you have a Marine Expeditionary Force on board. So you have 4,000 soldiers and sailors. Today they were strafed by the Venezuelan Air Force. You could very well have an incident down there, and something could happen. But I think you've got to drop the hammer on these cartels and let them know that the day of just law enforcement's over. We're going to interdict this. And hey, if you're coming across the border and you got drugs heading to America, you should understand you're an open target. You're going to have a lot less open speedboats heading around now because of that. And I realize it's quite tough, but we got to get tough. The country's being destroyed by fentanyl and these drugs, and it's time to send a message. I think the message has been sent.
Steve Bannon, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.